excited to have an esteemed panel with us to discuss and deliberate about a very pertinent topic facing India, the clean energy transition. Specifically post the COP26 Glasgow World Summit. This has actually taken a center stage and has become very critical. Also, faced with the geopolitical issues that the world is currently facing and the turmoil which the world is facing, this is increasingly becoming very critical. So just to introduce the panel, we have amongst us Mr. Mr. Aniruddha Kumar. Mr. Kumar is an Indian Revenue Service Officer, 1987 batch, who has served as the Additional Secretary, Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, and previously as the Joint Secretary, Ministry of Power in the Government of India. Hello, sir. Then we have Mr. Dr. Rahul Walwarkar. Dr. Walwarkar is the founder and president of India Energy Storage Alliance and is the chair of Global Energy Storage Alliance. Rahul holds a PhD in engineering and public policy from Carnegie Mellon University, master's in energy management from New York Institute of Technology, and a degree in electrical engineering from Walchand College of Engineering, Mumbai. Hello, Rahul. Rahul has also been awarded the India Smart Grid Forum President's Award for his contribution to growth of smart grids in India. Then we have Mr. Shrimali. Mr. Shrimali is currently the head of Transition Finance Research at the University of Oxford. Transition finance, it was a new term for me too. So just to brief and everyone, transition finance is broadly defined as the provision of and use of financial products and services to support counterparties such as companies, sovereigns, and individuals to realize alignment with environmental and social sustainability goals. Gireesh holds a BTech from IIT Delhi in electrical engineering, master's from University of Minnesota, and a PhD in electrical engineering from Stanford University. He is currently based in Bay Area in US and shall soon be relocated to England to join University of Oxford. Hello, Gireesh. Yeah. We also have Mr. Jagabanta, whom I address as Jag. Jag is currently the principal and director at Rocky Mountain Institute, a leading global think tank in clean energy. At RMI, he is working on cutting-edge areas of climate change and energy transition in India, particularly focusing on electricity sector transformation and resilience building, vehicle electrification, battery storage and manufacturing, and the emerging hydrogen economy. Jag holds an MA in International Economics and Development from Johns Hopkins University and Bachelor's in Mechanical Engineering from National University of Singapore. So we have this diverse set of panelists to discuss this critical topic. I start with Mr. Kumar on India's stand at COP26. To better understand India's stand in COP26 from the perspective of the government. And there were a lot of questions surrounding it. And so just to have a better understanding of it. So, sir, at last November's COP26 in Glasgow, India set a target date of 2070 to achieve turning net zero in terms of the greenhouse gas emission. Could you please help us understand the government's rationale in this regard? So, sorry, sir, you're in mute.
Thank you very much, Aman, and very good morning to my US participants and very good evening to my Indian participant in the panel. Thanks, Aman, for having me on this prestigious panel. It's really a great opportunity for me to state about what India is doing. But before that, I'll take a minute that after Industrial Revolution, man has made tremendous progress in every field, be it science and technology, be it medical sciences. Quality of life has improved many folds. Longevity has improved. We have conquered the moon. We have faster means of transportation. We have IT revolution, which has reduced the world to a It's a small village. We can connect to anyone, like we are connecting with you. Me and Aman used to be neighbor, in fact, at Pandara Road, and we are still neighbor here. So you can understand the power of ID technology. But last but not the least, we have also manufactured enough stockpile of nuclear weapons which can wipe out this entire humanity many times. So despite of all this progress, man is still facing existential crisis today. And one of the reasons for facing this existential crisis is climate change and global warming. We have all witnessed the increase in the frequency of extreme climate events. We have all increased the melting of Arctic ice, polar ice, and a rise in the sea levels. And if this temperature rise is not contained below 2 degrees centigrade as compared to the pre-industrial era, the world is really facing a catastrophe. And there has been a lot of debate and discussion. Countries had made pledges and promises. They have gone back and forth. There have been differences of opinion. Pledges were made in COP22 in Kyoto, Japan. Paris in 2015. But some of the countries actually did not live up to those promises. And I will take pride that India did live up to the promises made in COP22 in 2015 in Paris. We have talked the walk. We have walked the talk which we made in Paris in 2015. And we have upgraded those targets in recent Glasgow summit as compared to what we pledged in 2015. And fortunately now this realization has drawn upon the mankind that business as usual is not sustainable unless transformative changes are made in the way we live, the way the technology, the substitution of existing source of energy by renewable source of energy. And for the first time, I am seeing the consensus on the table that, okay, all the players means business. They want to actually bring down the emissions. They want to phase out the fossil fuels to give a chance this humanity to survive. And this present commitments at the Glasgow summit and the body language of the leaders there is a huge encouragement to me. So far as India is concerned, in Paris, we made a commitment that we will be achieving 40% of our total electricity generating capacity through non-fossil fuel sources. And we will be reducing our carbon intensity of GDP by 33 to 35% as compared to 2005. And in Glasgow, we have upgraded those commitments that by 2030, we will have 50% of our electricity generation capacity from non-fossil fuel sources. And we not only committed this reduction, increase in the non-fossil fuel capacity, we also committed to the net zero by 2070, which is a very challenging task for India, given the fact that our present dependence upon fossil fuel is to the extent of 75%. The share of renewable sources or other sources other than fossil fuel in India's energy basket is only 25%. And it is going to be a humongous challenge, not only for India, but also for developed countries, because India is not living on an island. We are all sailing in the same boat. It is not like none of us will survive that we have reduced our emission, but our neighboring countries or China or America or X or Y, Z, they have not reduced their emission. We all will sink together or we all will swim together. So we have to collaborate, coordinate by heart, and support the developing countries like India by way of generous financial grants, by way of sharing of technology, because in India is a growing country, our per capita electricity consumption is still far, far behind as compared to the global electricity average, global electricity consumption. I'll not repeat the rhetoric that our per capita emission is only 2 ton per person as compared to 16 to 17 ton per person in many of the developed countries. And our share in the inventory of the carbon already circulating in the global environment is minuscule. It's not even 1%. The inventory of the carbon already circulating in the environment has been contributed by the developed nation, and our share in that is minuscule 1%. But being a responsible global city, I think India has done pretty well. Today, we have almost 10% of our share of electrical energy coming from renewable sources of energy, that is wind and solar. And if we add hydro also, it goes to up to 12 to 13%. And in last 7 years, we have increased our renewable capacity by 2 times. In 2014, we were 76 gigawatt, and today we are at 152 gigawatt, which is a good progress by any yardstick for a poor country like India, which is the star of the capital, which does not have the latest technology with it. And our RE installed capacity, which I exclude large hydro projects also, it has grown 3 times since 2014 when we made commitment at the Paris. And we hope to reach 175 gigawatt by the end of this year. And we have drawn out a strategy to reach 450 gigawatt of renewable plus another 50 gigawatt of non-fossil fuel energy sources like hydro and nuclear, so that we can meet our mandate of 500 gigawatt of renewable energy by 2050. Here, I would like to make a small correction that what commitment we have made, it is actually what we meant was 50% share in the electrical energy, not the entire energy. Today, only 18% of our energy come from non-fossil fuel sources. The rest of the 82% energy come from fossil fuel sources. So let me clarify this. I have consulted my Ministry of Environment and Forest friends also, and MNRE friends also. What we meant was that we will be achieving 50% of electricity energy requirement by 2030. And to that extent, for achieving those targets, we have initiated many policies and many initiatives. You all know that we are subsidizing solar rooftop, decentralized solar generation. And we have formulated a very ambitious scheme of solarizing the agriculture pump. Almost 20% of electricity is consumed by the agriculture sector in India. So the call given by our Prime Minister is that you solarize all those agriculture pumps in next 5 to 10 years, so that our dependence upon fossil fuel goes down. And not only our dependence upon fossil fuel goes down, the farmer becomes free from the burden of paying for the electricity, because solar energy is free once it is installed. So center and state government, the central government and the federal governments are giving very generous subsidy. But there are challenges in this scheme for land acquisition, the last mile connectivity, and the arranging finance from the banks. But we are progressing well on that scheme. Then we have put it together a solar park scheme where some state governments and the central government undertakings pool the land mass together, create the infrastructure for setting up the solar power plant, so that it is a plug and play for the solar power developer. They just come, take the land, put up the plant, transmission is arranged, the land is there, all the maintenance facilities are there, connectivity is there. They just put up the plant, sign the PPAs with the consumers and start generating. Then we have the scheme of wind power support. For supporting wind power, we had GPI, but now we have phased out the generation-based incentive, and we are committed to promote the offshore wind in India. Fortunately, India is endowed with the very generous renewable energy potential, 700 gigawatt of solar energy potential estimated, and same is about the wind. So we have been able to harness only a fraction of it, and I have no doubt that with the right technology and the support from the developed countries, we will be able to achieve this target of 500 gigawatt by 2030. That's all to begin to say. Then rest, as the discussion progresses, I will be pitching in with the exact statistics, because I didn't want to bore the audience with the numbers and the details of the schemes and final details and all that.
Thank you, sir. So we'll come back to you, sir, in regards to the India National Grid and how that is what are the infrastructural constraints which the country is facing in terms of the clean energy transition. But before that, I move to Dr. Walwarkar. Uh, so Rahul, as Mr. Kumar has just pointed out, like currently India's has about 75% of the fossil consumption in its overall energy basket. Now, as we transition to cleaner energy, I understand there would be a huge requirement for storage. And we have two forms of storage which are becoming commercially viable. One is the advanced batteries, and the other one is hydrogen, of course, as we know. So how do you see the capacities in this regard coming up in India? When I say the capacity, the manufacturing capacity in India coming up in the decade ahead and the years ahead. Who are the key private players? What are the challenges that they are facing? And challenges, bottlenecks, and is there enough support infrastructure being created in order to facilitate the demand? Please.
So thanks, Aman, for this question. And again, it's a honor to be present amongst the dignitaries for this prestigious conference. And I think it's funny to get a question about energy storage manufacturing for you, because I think you and Jagabanta have played an instrumental role in creating the policies for this. But yeah, I do believe that energy storage has tremendous opportunities in India. I think for benefit of audience. So as you mentioned, I did my PhD in US and as a customized energy solutions, worked in US between 2004 to 2010, when energy storage industry was just starting off in US, and also served on board of director of US Energy Storage Association. I moved to India in 2010 and was immediately convinced that actually India has a tremendous value for energy storage technologies, and India can actually leapfrog in terms of the adoption rather than waiting for rest of the developed countries to adopt storage and then take another 10 years to adopt it. So we started India Energy Storage Alliance in 2012 with the goal of first creating awareness, and then in 2016 we set up the vision that we want to make India a hub for R&D, manufacturing, and adoption of technologies, rather than just first focusing on just getting the cheapest solutions from either China or other countries, and then maybe take time to start manufacturing. Now with Niti Aayog's initiative, I think the Advanced Chemistry Cell Battery Manufacturing Program, which was approved by Cabinet last year, has been a game changer for the industry. Because now there is a 50 gigawatt hour of advanced battery manufacturing has already been selected under the ACC PLI program, where 4 companies have been selected for setting up the initial 50 gigawatt hour manufacturing. But the work which has happened on ground over the last 2 years while the ACC PLI scheme was getting formed, there are a lot more corporates who are now convinced that India has a role for advanced energy storage manufacturing. And beyond these 4 companies who are getting the ACC PLI incentive, there are at least 4 to 5 additional companies which we believe will set up gigafactories in India. So actually, as IESA, we do anticipate that we will start off with maybe around 20-25 gigawatt hour of annual manufacturing capacity for advanced batteries in India by 25. That can get scaled up to even almost 70 gigawatt hour by 2027. And we want to continue building on that and get to at least 500 gigawatt hour manufacturing in India by 2035, because we see that in terms of as energy storage technologies are becoming more affordable, more and more applications and segments are going to need these technologies beyond just the initial EV adoption or initial large RE adoption. I think energy storage technologies have more than 30 different applications where storage technologies can be used. And as the performance keeps on improving, as well as cost keeps on going down, the market size will keep on growing exponentially. In fact, by the time 2035, we expect India will need annual energy storage market would be more than 600 to 700 gigawatt hour. So that's our expectation in terms of the market size. You also ask about green hydrogen, and I think many times people do sort of assume that, oh, when you're talking about different storage technologies, they are fighting with each other, and it is either one or other. But in fact, the way we feel, or as IESA, we have always worked for the last 10 years, is to try to make sure that we create policies which remove barriers for all forms of storage technologies, and then whichever technology meets the application requirement and the commercial requirement can get the market. And in fact, the green hydrogen is not necessarily actually competing with battery storage, or even for that matter, say pumped storage, because electricity is going to be decarbonizing maybe only 20 or 30% of the total energy in India. There is still large amount of primary energy consumption which is happening with fossil fuels, which is for say petroleum industry, for fertilizers, as well as other industries, which is very hard to decarbonize, or even like including steel and cement, decarbonize just by introducing more renewable energy in the grid. So if we really have to move towards the 70% by 2070, moving towards the net zero, we have to start holistically on decarbonizing all the sector. And that's where green hydrogen will play a very key role, because many of these sectors are already using hydrogen, be it gray hydrogen right now. But with the advances happening with especially electrolyzers and with the cost reduction happening with renewable energy, it is expected that between 25-27, green hydrogen will start competing with gray hydrogen. So if we can actually play smart and policies can enable deployment and proving these technologies on ground, as well as the investment starts happening on the electrolyzer manufacturing, then India can also become a hub for green hydrogen. And that actually creates additional opportunity for battery storage or pumped hydro or other technologies, because with green hydrogen, you are not going to use these electrolyzers and use them just with 30% capacity factor, just coupled with solar or just coupled with wind. So we do believe that actually green hydrogen is going to be essential for India to scale up our renewable capacity to 500 gigawatt, because that is going to create additional demand for the renewable energy. And coupled with electrochemical or other energy storage technologies, these will make green hydrogen a reality sooner, rather than looking at it as a competition between one another.
Right. Thank you, Rahul. So now from the policy, we move to private sector participation in two critical storage areas. We move to Gireesh in order to understand the regulatory framework globally, which is evolving in terms of the climate-related risk and its disclosures. Because greenhouse gas emission reduction ultimately is a voluntary exercise. So there is much more to clean energy transition than the COP26 commitments or global commitments on account of greenhouse gas emission, specifically for a developing economy like and large economy like India. So there are these implicit and explicit costs which are emerging, and one of the prominent ones and the pertinent ones among those is on account of climate-related risk disclosures. Recently, we had an SEC circular where the regulator is actually mandating all the companies in US to disclose climate-related risks in line with the financial disclosures which the regulator has been seeking. So now I move to Gireesh in order to understand how is the overall global regulatory framework for climate-related risk disclosure really evolving, and how do you perceive its impact on cost of capital?
Thanks, Aman. It's a pleasure to be here on this panel. So you asked kind of a bunch of questions in your opening comments. So let's see how far I go, and please do feel free to ask follow-up questions. I just wanted to take a step back, and as you said, for many people, it may not be clear as to what we are talking about. Areas are relatively new. So just to kind of very high level, the basic idea is that climate change will pose significant financial risks to the firms and the economy. Now, how does climate change affect the financial system, right? And that's what we are looking at. And there are basically two main channels. One is the channel of physical risks, which is related to climate change causing damage to property, infrastructure, and land. And the second one, which is called the transition risk, it results from changes in climate policy, technology, and even consumer and market sentiment shifting due to a transition to a low carbon economy. Now, there's been kind of recognition that these risks are kind of known, but to kind of manage these risks, we need to first measure them. And there's been a lot of work that's happening, as Aman mentioned, from a voluntary basis. For example, there was a recent study that estimated that real estate portfolios would lose annual returns by as much as 40% by the end of this decade because of the physical risks. But if you want to do that in order to undertake climate risk analysis that can inform decision making across the financial system, regulators and financial institutions need reliable, consistent, and comparable data, right, on the projections for climate risk. What is the exposures? What is the sensitivities, and what are the vulnerabilities of these institutions to climate risk? So that kind of sets up the stage for this need for transparency in climate risk disclosures, because you need to be able to measure something to be able to manage it, and this information is required at a global scale. And many protocols have started to develop. There is a task force for climate related financial disclosures. It's called TCFD, has emerged over time. The central banks have started on this network for greening the financial system, and central banks are starting to impose regulations around climate risk similar to financial risks. So recognizing, and the reason is that these regulators are recognizing the climate risks are systemic. They're system wide, as Mr. Kumar was also mentioning. They're just not localized, they're system wide. So financial regulators are saying, okay, we need to have this information out in the public so that stakeholders can make informed decisions. And therefore, these financial regulators are moving towards mandatory climate risk financial disclosures. As Aman mentioned, the US, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, had a 1 year long consultation, and they have just released some climate risk disclosure rules, and they're likely to make them mandatory after a public review that's going on. Similarly, in the recent COP in Glasgow, the UK announced mandatory climate risk disclosures starting April, which is now. And then we also know the European Union is also likely to announce these disclosures anytime now. So the world is moving in this direction. Now, what's happening in India, right? I mean, in terms of, is India following up? India is a little bit behind on this, but I just want to kind of highlight some of the kind of developments that are happening in India. The Securities and Exchange Board of India, which is SEBI, has introduced new reporting requirements for sustainability by listed entities by 2021, so which is last year. And this new standard called the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Report is reporting an older business responsibility report. And for now, it's going to be applicable to 1,000 companies, the top 1,000 companies, with voluntary implementation in this year, and then mandatory implementation next year onwards. In terms of scope, the SEBI disclosure requirements are still, they remain qualitative to a large extent. There is a coverage of reporting requirements for emissions, carbon emissions, and I can talk a little bit more about that. But there is no real kind of direct coverage of climate risk disclosure as of yet. But the way things are moving, I think my sense is the SEBI stance is that they will be incremental on this. So, I will stop here on my kind of initial comments, and happy to come back to more focused kind of numbers, as Naman you were asking about cost of capital and etc. Yeah. And some kind of number-based stuff. But I wanted this to be kind of a broader kind of high-level kind of opening remark.
Sure. So we'll come back to you, Gireesh, on this. I move on to Jag, and moving back to where we left with Rahul on the storage aspect. So could you dwell deep into the demand buckets for battery storage that are evolving in India, be it electric mobility, be it grid storage, and how are they competing in terms of the price parity? Yeah, so.
So no, definitely, and thanks, Aman, for inviting me to this panel, and really delighted to be part of this. So yeah, I mean, Rahul has already initiated a lot of the conversation on battery, but let me delve a little deeper into how ARMA has been seeing how the battery market might evolve in India. And of course, all projections come with a bit of caveat, but instead of the absolute, the trick is to look at the direction, and the directions are all pointing in to the North Star that the demand for battery will be there. The magnitude can be debated about, upon, but it is inevitable. Of course, as Aman highlighted, India is marching on its move towards cleaning up its transportation infrastructure, particularly through focusing on vehicle electrification, and that is tremendously potentially going to drive EV demand up. Now, of course, everything depends on how much the market uptake happens. In India's case, we do expect the uptake to be more bottom driven, by which I mean more driven by the early adopters from two-wheelers and three-wheelers, which will create the volume. Because of course, as Aman was highlighting, the price parity issues, four-wheelers still, commercial cars, unlike adoption in more developed countries, adoption in India will have to be driven by those. E-bus adoption will all drive a lot of volume market growth because of the large size of batteries that you expect from them. And there has been a lot of encouragement through policies from the central as well as state government in India to encourage those. Now, the more, and that is going through fairly, robustly. What is more interesting, and which relates to what where Aniruddha ji pointed in the beginning, is the 500 gigawatt goal, 450, 500, depending on how you account for the non-renewable side of the non-fossil fuel mix. And that's where both the opportunity size and the challenge also emerges. So we did a fair bit of analysis to estimate how much battery demand could result if we have to integrate 450 gigawatt renewable into India's grid by 2030, and the demand numbers are pretty humongous. It's anywhere between 26 gigawatt to 65 gigawatt, depending on, of course, how the scenario, storylining, whether you assume coal retirement, aspects like that. Now, regardless of where the actual number lands up, both numbers are humongous from where we are. Now, but to enable that market, and this is where happy to go into the weeds as follow-up, but tremendous effort needs to happen, both at the central policy level as well as the utilities level, because to enable this, you need your utilities to know how to use those assets, how to monetize those assets. You need the right regulatory framework to allow for batteries to provide the services to the grid, and to be able to value those services. There are already a lot of policy movement in that direction. The ancillary services market movement happening. There is this movement on what you call the embed or market-based economic dispatch. This is more into the weeds of the electricity market. So a lot of movement happening on how to enable the policy architecture that will allow for better integration of renewable, and batteries are going to play a big part of it. Now, there are, of course, upside and downside risks to any of these projections, any of these outlooks. What we are seeing in the global ecosystem very more recently, but also have been foreseeing for a while, is the impact of that supply crunch is going to make on battery prices. And while the current impact on the battery prices can be treated to a degree as a shock, but there is also a long-term trend that you foresee about if the upstream, the supply chain side of battery materials, it gets constrained as global trade environment tightens up, as your commited over. Now, those things are, of course, going to potentially result in both negative and positive push. Negative push in the sense that your traditional battery chemistries are going to face an price risk. But there is an industry that impetus for industry to diversify, move into R&D for newer chemistries, to diversify away from existing chemistry types, which depends a lot on certain kind of materials where price risks are high. That is happening already. You can see from acquisition that's happening in the battery space in India, where people are looking at sodium-ion batteries. People are looking at alternate chemistries. Now, the third bucket is the whole circular economy aspects of it that I would like to highlight, is and concerns especially for India. When it comes to the fact that, at least for the cathode material, we don't have too much of domestic supply sources. Now, that would mean that reuse, recycling are going to be extremely crucial to India. May not be that crucial in the 2030 timeframe, because you may not see the demand, but look, like batteries in an EV is meant to retire in 5, 7, 8 years. Like, even if you push it out to a few years, all the EVs you're seeing getting deployed, the batteries from there will have to be retired in a decade time frame, and you're suddenly going to see an influx of it. Now, that can be both a problem and opportunity. There's a whole waste management problem that can emerge, but for the case of India, if you want to make your battery manufacturing ecosystem sustainable and also energy secure large degree, that could constitute a supply of raw materials that India doesn't possess. We did some not back of the envelope, but a fair bit of rigorous number crunching to estimate what could that range look like. So it could be anywhere between 5 to 20, 30% of the material India needs to fulfill its 50 gigawatt hour manufacturing target, if you place the right policy environment, encourage the right entrepreneurship to partake in the recycling and reuse. The last point is, of course, the reuse part is where the second life. So a lot of these batteries which are going to retire can have alternate use cases for grid application, and that can be complementary to the whole renewable integration storyline, ambition as well. I'll pause here. I'm happy to deep dive more, but Aman, over to you. Yeah.
Can you just give us some numbers of the demand in different buckets by 2030 for battery storage?
So I will give you the total. I don't have it the breakup at the back of my head, but roughly around anywhere between 105 to 260 gigawatt hour annually, depending on the two scenarios that we run. Conservative and an aggressive, where you assume a higher aggressive adoption of EVs. Now we have, right. Adoption of EV policies. Now you look at, out of that, roughly almost 40 to 50% could be grid tight if the 500 gigawatt target is going to be met. It creates a substantial demand. EVs are the most substantial. I mean, and it's the more market-based demand creation sector, while given where grid-tight storage is right now, there needs to be a lot more policy movement to actually, reach that target. But yeah, so that could be the ballpark number that you could be looking at. Yeah.
Thank you, Jack. So now I come back to Mr. Kumar, sir. Just to get an understanding, like as of now, India's total electricity share in the overall energy basket stands at about 18 to 20%. How can we increase it? Obviously, like one of the mechanism and to go for clean energy and increase the share of renewables in the overall energy basket is actually to go is to electrify the equipments, electrify automobiles, and increase the share of electricity in overall energy consumption. So how viable technically, financially is it for India to increase its electricity share of the overall energy consumption from current 18% to, let's say, 30% and 50%? A level 50% is a level which has been achieved by many countries in Europe. I do understand that there are some natural advantages those countries have in terms of the storage, but can India achieve that? And where does India's national grid stand today in terms of supporting this kind of a transition? Thank you.
Aman, before I come to your present question, can I supplement the answers given by my previous speakers on
Absolutely, sir. Please go ahead.
hydrogen or
Please go ahead,
the
sir.
estimate for requirement of storage and all that?
Please go ahead,
So,
sir.
over the requirement for storage is considered, we have done a study, the optimal energy mix. I think you were also part of that, Aman, when you were in Niti Aayog.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And that has been now fine-tuned by using the latest modeling techniques over the software Ordena. So that has estimated the requirement of 34 gigawatt hour of storage by 2030. We have to achieve 50% of the fossil fuel capacity, non-fossil fuel capacity by that time. So that is one number. So I am not aware what will be the requirement from the transportation sector or other sectors. So far as grid storage requirement is concerned, that has been pretty well estimated, which is 34 gigawatt hour storage. Whether it will, that is technology agnostic. That could be hydrogen, that could be battery, that could be any other form of storage, that could be pumped storage also. So that is one number which I would like to place before this panel and before the audience, that number has been estimated pretty precisely. Now coming to the hydrogen, like how do we proceed to the hydrogen? Hydrogen is a nascent technology. It is quite expensive also. The present estimated cost of production of hydrogen is around $3 to $4, which is certainly economically unviable for most of the sectors. And most certainly for the generation of electricity as a storage. So what the government is contemplating is a two-step approach in this regard. Okay, first at the first stage, we will not use hydrogen as a storage for electricity generation of electricity. We will use green hydrogen for industrial sectors like refinery, where it is used. We will use green hydrogen for fertilizer sector. And we will use green hydrogen for steel sector, where it is used as a feedstock. So we are saved from the cost of fuel cell and the wastage in the process of storage and then again conversion to the electricity, which is 60%. So almost 40% of the energy is wasted when we use green power to produce hydrogen and then use that hydrogen again to generate electricity through fuel cells. Almost 30 to 40% energy is wasted in this process as per the present technology. So what government is contemplating, okay, let us focus upon utilization of green hydrogen as a feedstock in industries so that we are able to develop an ecosystem of at least the electrolyzers and we achieve the scale of economies. And it has been estimated that 10 billion ton of green hydrogen demand is already there, even if we impose 10% green hydrogen consumption obligation on these industries, which are fertilizer, which is steel, which is fertilizer, steel, and fertilizer, steel, which is the other industry.
Refinery, sir.
Refinery. So these three industries can take for 10 million tons of green hydrogen, and which will require 30 gigawatt of renewable energy. So that is one number which I look to put on the table, and the proposal is already under consideration of the government. It is being considered, like there is a process of interministerial consultation. That interministerial consultation is over. It is now before the Ministry of Finance, which is mulling over it. Then it will go to the cabinet, and it will be part of this one consolidated proposal. Then what we are also looking for it is the R&D support for the entire value chain of the hydrogen, like from generation of hydrogen, green hydrogen, then storage of and transportation of green hydrogen, and then fuel cells. R&D support for all the entire value chain of the hydrogen utilization system in India. And then we are also contemplating the PLI kind of schemes for electrolyzers and the fuel cells. So it is still under discussion. I am not committing anything. It is still under discussion stage with the government of India, and government is pretty positive about it. It's only question of fine-tuning the numbers, the requirement, the availability of budget, but it will definitely, there is a ownership by the government to do this kind of a proposal. So this will happen sooner or later. Regarding the storage requirement, I have already told you, and regarding the regulatory requirement to mandate use of green power, So we may not have disclosure, like Gireesh already told you that only 2-3 days ago, CBS come out with the disclosure requirement regarding the sustainability aspect of their business. But we already have RPO where each consumer is mandated to consume at least 22% of total electricity requirement from green power sources or green energy. Then we have come out, some of the DISCOMs have come out with a very innovative kind of a system to promote green power consumption in India, like Maharashtra Electricity Regulatory System. They have come out with a special tariff for green power. Suppose there is a consumer, which is a responsible consumer, who wants to use green power. So they say that they have come out with a tariff that if the consumer is willing to pay that tariff, then the DISCOM will procure that much of green power, cool it, and supply that green power to that particular consumer. So that consumer can make itself net zero by paying little premium over the usual price of power. And the premium is not much. It is only 3 rupees 68 paisa, which is roughly 5 cents a unit, which is minuscule as compared to the European countries where the residential tariffs are in this range of $20 cents or 20 euro cents. So Maharashtra regulators have come out with such kind of a regulation that you can consume green power by paying little premium, and then you will be net zero. So that will promote, I hope so, other regulators are also going to follow the same kind of regulation and going to come out. I had a discussion with the Secretary CERC yesterday, and they said that other regulators are also contemplating the similar kind of regulation in their states. And hopefully this will become a very, very sort of a norm of the day, and this will promote green energy consumption in India. Then regarding the building aspect of it, the use of green energy in building, we have Energy Conservation Building Code by Bureau of Energy Efficiency, which has been adopted by most of the states. So all the building bylaws and the building designs have to be compliant with this Energy Conservation Building Code. And that will also lead to substantial reduction in the carbon emission and the reduction in the electricity. So, so these were, I wanted to supplement the replies given by my previous speakers on all these issues.
Right.
So now coming to the question,
if we can highlight on the
use of electricity in the overall energy basket. Yes, you said it very right.
Currently, it's 18%. How can we increase the share and the impact on the grid?
It's 18%. Our total energy consumption is of the order of 7,000 million kilowatt hour, out of which only 1,300 million kilowatt hour is from the electrical energy. So, but this is the usual process of development. As the economy grows, the share of electricity in the energy basket grows. And in India, transportation sector is a major source of consumption of energy. The transportation sector accounts for almost 13% of the energy consumption. So if we are able to move to e-mobility or hydrogen-based mobility, straight away this 13% can be brought into the ambit of electricity generation. Then another important sector in India is agriculture. I mentioned in my earlier comments also that agriculture is a major energy consumer. India is primarily an agrarian country. 60% of the population depends upon the agriculture, and its share in the energy basket is almost 10%, 8 to 10%, including the diesel, which is primarily fossil fuel driven. So we have come out with a scheme called Kusum, which I told you earlier, where we want to substitute or replace all the diesel powered pumps by solar power pumps. And so that will reduce the dependence upon fossil fuel and increase the share of electricity in the overall energy basket. And similarly, the green hydrogen in the industries, which is now produced using fossil fuels by natural gas or by LNG or ammonia, which is gray hydrogen we are using. If we can substitute that gray hydrogen by green hydrogen, that will again increase the share of electricity in the overall energy consumption basket. So these are the major areas where I feel where we can substitute the fossil fuel to electrical energy, and that to green electrical power, and reduce our carbon emission.
Yes. And so, if you could talk a little about the resilience of India's current grid.
That's a very important question. Yes.
Yes.
In the last 6 years, we have made tremendous progress in the grid. Now it is one nation, one grid. We can transport any amount of electricity from one part of the country to another part of the country. In fact, let me share one number with you. In fact, we have our utilization ratio of present transmission system is only to the extent of 15%. Isn't it a very surprising number then? So we are using only 15% of our current transmission network. So there is enough resilience, enough spare capacity in the system to transmit green electricity. Then in addition to this, we have two schemes going on to integrate more renewable electricity in the grid. That is, one is ISTS. We are building a 66.5 gigawatt transmission system exclusively for integration of renewable energy. And then this is interstate. And then we have intra-state, where we are giving subsidy or grant to the extent of 40% or 33% to the states for transmission of green power within the state, when we have been supported by the KFW and other countries also in this attempt. And this will also facilitate around 40 gigawatt of renewable energy in the grid. So transmission resilience is not a question at all. Transmission capacity is not a question at all. And similarly, you must have heard about the Prime Minister announcement about the 7.5 gigawatt of solar park in Leh.
Right, sir.
So we have already started working upon it. We propose to have a 10 gigawatt solar park in Leh. The process of identification of land and environmental clearances, etc., is on. The detailed project report for transmission of electricity from Leh to the mainland, because Leh, there is no captive consumption or sufficient consumption in Leh. So the entire power will be required to be transmitted to the mainland. For that also, Power Grid Corporation of India has prepared a detailed project report. The cost of that project is around 40,000 crore, which is roughly $7 billion or $6 billion. And government has committed to support the cost of this project to the extent of 40%. So which shows the commitment of government to promote the green energy in India through government sources or through whatever regulatory means or the tax incentives or tax deferrals. So government in principle has agreed to support the cost of this Leh transmission system by 40%, and balance 60% will be borne by the developer, which will be sufficient to defray. They can recover the cost of investment by charging the transmission tariff from the users. So that is all from my side. Any supplementary question, I'll be happy to take.
Thank you so much. I'll just move to Rahul now. Rahul, just wanted to understand from you the now government has successfully implemented PLI in two sectors. There's been a phenomenal response. And as we understand, the contours of the PLI have predominantly get scale in India, get value capture in India, start manufacturing, meet the KPIs, and the government gives you the money. How has been the response? Does the private sector, the investors seek any sort of a modification in this structure going forward? Because compared to the earlier schemes which we have, there were a lot of earlier schemes in regard to the capex grant in terms of support infrastructure. They haven't really materialized and has never seen this kind of a success. We have seen phenomenal success on mobile phone PLI, then solar, then battery storage now. What has been the overall response, and going forward, do we see such scheme being taken forward as Mr. Kumar also highlighted into electrolyzers and other support infrastructure for clean energy transition?
So thanks, Aman. I think I am one of the believers. So I have been, although as you mentioned, this was a completely new way of looking at how to incentivize manufacturing. And there was, being a democracy, there was a lot of debate, lot of different opinions. Obviously, people who are used to getting incentives in certain way found it very hard to digest. But we as the India Energy Storage Alliance from start realized that this was perhaps the only chance what India had to get onto the manufacturing for especially advanced batteries. If we had missed this timeline already, we are probably 2 to 3 years late as compared to where we wanted. But if we would have missed this window, then probably it would have been almost impossible for India to get into the advanced battery manufacturing ecosystem. So we have supported this wholeheartedly. And when I say we, it is not just the members of the IESA team, but I think the IESA stakeholders, which include now more than 150 companies who are involved in complete ecosystem for this. In fact, last 6 months have been very, very refreshing as compared to maybe the first year, where there were lots of different opinions. Everyone wanted to tweak the scheme in certain way. I think once people realize that, no, this is happening, cabinet approval come in, actually it has accelerated lot of discussions around setting up value addition in India. In fact, some of the numbers which have come up for value addition in India, I still cannot believe what some of the winners of the PLI have promised. So I hope that that becomes a reality rather than just playing a game in terms of taking some penalties. But I think the ACC PLI had a good combination of both carrot and stick approach. What we are most excited is that right now there are more than 20 companies who are looking into investing into various components and supply chain for especially processing, high-end chemical processing required for the battery grade supply chain. And in fact, as IESA in December last year, we floated India Battery Supply Chain Council, IBSCC, as a initiative to try to get into now details of how do we get into the upstream and midstream activities related to the cell manufacturing, and how do we again leapfrog there, rather than just saying that we are going to replicate what processes are being used in China. Because again, when China set up most of the manufacturing, I think the focus was clearly on just price reduction, and some of the issues related to the environmental compliance and sustainability were not the key parts as part of the, especially the manufacturing process. Now we are seeing that not just India, but especially actually Europe has taken a huge lead on making domestic manufacturing. US is following the step. And in both these regions, I think the sustainability and some of the other ESG criteria will be very important if India wants to become a alternate or maybe a second supplier next to China for meeting some of the requirements for these countries. So it is really exciting that we are seeing already some of the ISA members talking about having actually net zero in terms of any emissions or pollution coming out of these processing plants, and setting up, looking at some of the innovative manufacturing processes which reduces the effluents, as well as maybe looking at alternate manufacturing processes which significantly reduces the water requirement for this chemical processing plants. So we are actually very, very happy with the kind of response we are getting. I don't want to declare victory because I know that next 18 months, 2 years are going to be really critical. There is a huge gap for skills required for setting up this type of industry. There is huge technical uncertainty. People do not know. It's very easy to just replicate something which has worked in one country and replicate. But if you are trying to change some of the things, it is very difficult. But where we take a lot of hope is like from companies like, say, Lucas TVS, who although did not win the PLI bid, but they were actually one of the first companies who ended up doing technology licensing with a path-breaking technology like 24M, which could be like a complete game changer in terms of how the lithium-ion batteries are being made. Or even the Reliance, where they are now betting on sodium-ion battery or some of these alternate things. So this, just even 1 year back, even I was not dreaming about some of these things happening in India. So to be frank, I am very happy, although a little bit cautious that we have a lot of more work to be done. And I just wish that we stop some of the random debate about what it should have been or how we can change it. Let's just get our act together and get focused and work. Now that the schemes are there, there are already, apart from the SEC PLI, there are various states have already come up with incentives for supporting battery and EV manufacturing. So it is not only about the SEC PLI. There are other both central and state government incentives and other programs which are available. And this, the market is big enough for accommodating a lot more. So yeah, that's what we are hoping for.
Thank you. So coming to Gireesh and going back to the same topic, that we were talking about the cost of capital this time. Like now, in the recent budget, the government of India has also announced about the policy around and the intent to issue green bonds. If you could just dwell deeper into what determines the pricing of green bonds. Is it only the demand and supply? Like there is a lot of supply, a lot of institutional investors, be it endowments, so on and so forth. They want to lend to green projects, and thus there's more supply, less demand, hence the prices are coming down. Is it just because of that, or are there actual calculations which go behind this, the climate related risk factors, and these projects which are getting or which are eligible for getting green financing have lower risk compared to the other projects? That really determines or drives the cost of capital.
Yeah, thanks, Aman. So just like last time, I wanted to talk a little bit about, what's the impact on the corporations and impact on their financials, and then I'll come to the green bond question in a second.
Sure, please.
So when we look at all these increased regulations and there's this kind of whole issue of climate risks, there are multiple impacts that corporations are seeing. One is definitely just the whole issue of this measurement of emissions. And the measurement of emissions is going to happen at multiple levels, right? I mean, it's going to be scope 1 emissions, which is your own emissions, scope 2 emissions, which is the emissions coming from electricity, and scope 3 emissions that are coming from the supply chains. So what the organizations are starting to see an impact on is that they have to start measuring all these emissions and start reporting them. And there are going to be costs, risk, and opportunities associated with that. As I had mentioned before, the SEBI regulations require only scope 1 and scope 2, but there are international regulations that are starting to require scope 3 emission measurements, which is going to have an impact on Indian corporates. The second thing you start to see is these climate risks. They are going to start having an impact on the cash flows for the companies. For example, I mean, we did a study about a couple of years ago where we looked at the Indian coal sector, and we looked at 3 of the kind of major Indian corporates, kind of public-private entities, NTPC, the Coal India, and Indian Railways. And we looked at the kind of the transition risk to these entities due to increasing renewable energy penetration in the power sector. And we're able to show that, compared to a business as usual scenario where you're like just following the trends versus going to now, which is kind of a stated target of 500 gigawatts of renewables, there was approximately $10 billion of transition risk to these entities, which is significant. And a lot of this risk is going to kind of flow up to the Indian government in many ways. And this is just one exercise, but you can start seeing that there is the climate risk is going to start playing into the valuations, what so-called valuations of corporations. The third thing, which is what you're alluding to, is this whole issue of the cost of capital, which is used as a discount rate for figuring out valuations. And so far, most of the impact on valuations has been looked at from a perspective of reduction in revenues or increase in costs. But this is the third channel through which climate risks go into the financials of a company, right? And there has been global work on this, where actually there is a very, very famous study from Colombia from Patrick Bolton that shows that if you are exposed to carbon, your cost of capital can go up to by up to 4 percentage points for every standard deviation in or every increase in your exposure to carbon risk, which is significant. Similarly, we have done some work in India where we have compared the performance of the renewable companies versus the fossil fuel companies in the power sector. And we are able to show that the companies in the renewable energy sector have 12% higher returns, 20% lower volatility, and about 60% higher risk-adjusted returns, right? And that started to reflect into the actual cost of capital. Now, coming finally to your question about green bonds. The green bonds area is still, I would say, pretty nascent, and the pricing of the green bonds is still does not reflect the climate aspects. And so if you look at a kind of a very basic level, if you have a AAA rated green bond versus a AAA rated regular bond, there's, from a credit rating perspective, they are not that different. But one of the reasons is that the credit ratings do not include the climate risk yet. It's kind of a sidebar. Having said that, just to finish up, there sometimes you do see differences in the cost of capital of green bonds versus regular bonds, and that has to do with just higher supply for higher demand for these bonds, given the kind of the visibility these bonds have. But the hope is that over time, as climate risk starts getting factored into the credit ratings, then fundamentally green bonds will become cheaper at a fundamental level, as opposed to be driven by supply-demand dynamics. So I'm going to stop here, and hopefully, if there are more questions, happy to take them later.
Thank you, Gireesh. Yeah. Now moving back to Jag. Jag, I'll move back to we first spoke about the battery storage. Just wanted to understand, and taking forward from where Mr. Kumar also left, regarding the overall demand evolving for hydrogen in India. Could you share the buckets with us, in terms of, again, price parity, how these buckets are evolving? Fertilizer sector, be it transportation, and how these things are evolving?
Now, okay, I'll take a quick, and I'm agreed. I'm continuing from what Rahul mentioned and what Aniruddha mentioned on hydrogen, and the basic premise is always going to be the same. But I'll take a step back to break hydrogen apart a little bit for the audience. So there, depending on who you speak to, there's always this a little bit of a preconceived notion people come with when they speak to hydrogen. Whether if it's the transport people, they will completely look at hydrogen purely from what you call FCEV, your cars and trucks and everything. That lens. If you look at if you talk to power sector people, they're looking at it purely as a storage play. Now, if you take a step back, hydrogen ultimately is just a molecule, which has its utility as a chemical feedstock, which has its utility as a heating fuel, and which has its utility as an energy carrier. Now, again, getting back to the price parity question, it completely depends on how cheap a hydrogen you can get. Now, where demand is currently, and this is more true globally as well as for India, is most of the demand of, and hydrogen is being consumed in as an industrial feedstock for a very long period. Most of the demand in India is locked in your ammonia production and as a chemical process in fertilizer in refinery plants. Now, these two sectors are already paying the price for hydrogen. Right now, the hydrogen they're consuming is what we call gray hydrogen, which is produced from natural gas through a process called steam methane reformation. Where the interest in hydrogen specifically for India comes in is that there is this interesting alignment between India's RE resource and the fact that we are one of the cheapest and possibly the cheapest place for producing renewable energy in the world, and the fact that you can produce hydrogen by simple process, not simple, but at a commercial scale, but fairly, an electrolysis of water through electricity and then getting hydrogen out of it. Now, this is where our cost advantage potentially comes in, and there are, beyond just the demand buckets that I would delve into, there are other advantages that plays out. If you're able to guarantee, because of economy of scale, because of policy, a certain price level at which you can provide a renewable electricity, you could potentially be one of the most competitive source of what we call green hydrogen in the world. Green hydrogen essentially being hydrogen produced from electrolysis through renewable electricity. Now, what does this mean? It means for the first time in India's history, you could potentially have an energy molecule that is truly domestic. And that is a huge win for when you look at it from an energy securities perspective. We never had that. Even with batteries, you're going to potentially have to import cathode material, unless, of course, you diversify your material mix, newer chemistry, etc. or you reinvigorate and build on your recycling ecosystem. With hydrogen, of course, there are the electrolyzer technology itself has some degree of material intensity associated with it, but not quite compared to, let's say, batteries. So you have this opportunity, both in terms of the resources that you have, and the fact that like you have consumption sector which are already consuming. Now, getting back to where demand is, your demand are in two sectors chiefly right now. Ammonia and refinery, and future, as Aniruddha rightly pointed out, future expectations coming from steel, majorly, as well as heavy duty trucking. Now, if you, and then, I'm not getting into more speculative sectors. There is a whole movement towards greening the shipping industry going on right now, and the aviation industry, which are going to be big drivers of hydrogen growth. But that is more of a global play and where technology stands at that point. But to where, getting back, so if you look at all the demand sectors, hydrogen as a cost of end product is the cheapest in refinery. It's around 4 to at the most like 5, 6, 8%. And folks who in the refinery petrochem industry will give a better, more precise number, but it is comparatively tiny. So the sector is able to absorb any delta, that higher cost that comes with changing from gray to green. So initial stage, you're essentially trying to change mostly from your existing consumption of gray hydrogen to green hydrogen. Ammonia also has, absorbs a lot of gray hydrogen, but of course, ammonia is usually a feedstock into fertilizer, and fertilizer is a lot more price sensitive sector. And hydrogen is the cost of production of ammonia is excess of 90%. So if you, any changes to the hydrogen price makes a huge impact on the end product. Having said that, the size is big. Now, ammonia, you can think of it both as a fertilizer play and also as a potential hydrogen carrier for international hydrogen trade. And this is where the more interesting thing comes in. Of course, if you manage to lock in a lot of trade relationships. So you have your big potential hydrogen consumption countries in your South Korea, your Japan, potentially Germany, but it's a little way off for India. If you're able to get those renewable price and your electrolyzer price come down to the scale that makes India very, very competitive, you could potentially be one of the most competitive supplier of green hydrogen to these countries who are potentially going to be paying the premium to import green hydrogen because they are able to pay the price. So there is this export play that India needs to consider. At what timeline? That's of course a little bit more this thing to need to be thought about. There are cost consideration. There are considerations on technology. Also, the consideration is that India has never been a hydrocarbon exporting country. So getting all the legalities, regulations around that, setting up the infrastructure. There's a bit of that consideration, but there is a cost play there. Now, if you look at steel, it's one of the biggest, most consequential market for hydrogen, because to decarbonize steel, you can't use electricity in traditional process. So there are, and it's a bit of retooling as well. It's not like in the case of your refinery or your fertilizer. It's not the case of replacing A with B, with gray with green. With steel, you need to essentially come up with a new technology called DRI, which usually consumes natural gas, but in India's case, mostly the steel plant relies on coal as blast furnace uses. Now, there is a much bigger scope, because in the long run, if you're able to get to green hydrogen gas, any new steel plants could potentially be looking at being a green hydrogen consuming steel producer. And the demand for steel will only grow considering we are a fast industrializing and urbanizing society. It's a no-brainer when you look at it. Now, the last sector, which is of consequence, is the heavy-duty trucking and potentially buses, where hydrogen competes potentially with batteries and with fossil fuels, is in that space. When your range extends beyond a certain point, it doesn't compete well when you're looking at urban mobility because batteries competitiveness and the fact that you're commuting much smaller distance. When you're commuting a much higher distance, when you're carrying a much higher load, your what you call total cost of ownership is able to compete with definitely with your diesel. So there is a play, and it's a big potential long-term market if you are able to this thing. break it. Now, there are, I mean, I don't want to get into it unless you really want to understand hydrogen better, but there are a lot of infrastructure issues when it comes to investment required. There's a need, the hydrogen transportation hasn't been cracked, storage hasn't been cracked as well. The only point I want to make before I pass it back to you, Aman, is that on hydrogen as a storage for electricity, we have done some analysis. Terry has done a fairly robust analysis. Because of the cost as well as the battery's potential competitiveness, hydrogen is thought of as a long-term storage, not as short duration storage. So battery competes much better as short duration storage. Hydrogen potentially can be competitive as a long duration storage. The other caveat is, given India's load shape, you don't need that much of long duration storage that much. Hydrogen starts playing a part when you are able to have 70, 80% of renewable penetration in your country, which is, we are far off. Even by 2030, that 500 gigawatt ambition, you're not going to, it's far off from there. So there is this, thing about hydrogen's role as a storage. The Japanese, however, and I'll pause with this, are looking at hydrogen and green ammonia as a potential co-firing fuel for their coal plants. I think that it's worth studying whether it makes sense because of our existing coal assets. There could be a lot of inefficiencies because of round trip inefficiencies, because you have to make hydrogen, then burn it again. But worth looking at since the Japanese are considering, which we haven't considered. It's purely as looked at as storage. But that's where I will leave you with hydrogen. But in terms of growth expectation, in terms of numbers, we see potentially almost 4 or 5x. So roughly we consume roughly around 5 to 6 million tons. By 2050, you could easily see 30 million ton of hydrogen demand, out of which almost 85 to 90% can be green hydrogen at price parity, I would say.
Thank you, Jag. That was great insight. I go to Rahul. Rahul, I think you have some comments on this.
Yeah, so thank you, Aman, and I agree with most of the things Jagabanta mentioned, and also Aniruddha Kumarji mentioned on the green hydrogen. Just one thing I just wish, I think, based on our experience on the stationary energy storage, where I think we ended up missing the boat in last decade, where I think since 2013 we have been having too many committees discussing about how India can adopt storage and something, and every time it keeps on coming up, okay, when will storage become cheaper? Unless we put like some clear numbers on what do we mean by cheaper, there is always future is going to be cheaper. We never stop like buying a cell phone or buying a car or buying a laptop because there will be a cheaper laptop or better laptop or phone next year. You keep on using if it is something cost effective right now. And one way to do, which I think right now, I think Aniruddha ji can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think government is very much thinking about actually starting with blending between gray and green hydrogen, which actually somehow I take the ownership for, I think, missing the ability to convince decision makers is because we kept on talking about when batteries will become cheap enough for integrating them with the renewables, whereas we could have started integrating maybe 10% or 20% of the storage as compared to the large solar farms and wind farms which were getting installed in 2015, 16, 17, and we would have had a minor like maybe 20, 30, 40 paise kind of an increment in terms of having better quality power available, but somehow we kept on delaying the various pilot projects or including storage in the RFPs, saying that, oh, we want to become batteries cheaper. And while this discussion was happening, the battery prices became cheaper by a factor of 5x. It was not a 5%, 10%, 20%. There were like prices were at like $750, $800 when we were starting discussion about having pilot projects with energy storage when Dr. Satish Agnihotri was secretary for MNRE. Unfortunately, 4 secretaries later, we are still talking about when we will get cheaper batteries and now waiting for manufacturing to happen. So that's something which could kill actually the entire hydrogen industry if we wait, because the rest of the world is moving so fast. And especially if we want to make India the manufacturing hub, we cannot keep on waiting for prices to come down and then get into manufacturing. We have to start getting into manufacturing right now. We need to develop the skill set, the skilled labor around it, start developing technologies, adopting those technologies. It is not about just manufacturing technologies cheap. there are so many optimization things, because we as a customized energy solutions already manage more than 1500 megawatt hour of energy storage in North American market. So we know that for same storage asset, if you optimize it, if you operate it in a better way, you can almost like double its operating life, which can mean your levelized cost can come down significantly rather than waiting for the capex reduction. So unfortunately, we have been trying to tell this in every forum for last 10 years, but we could not convince. I hope that we learn from the mistakes where we missed on the energy storage side, and on green hydrogen, we don't repeat those mistakes.
Thank you, Rahul. So now I just take the closing remarks from all the panelists on the main topics that we've been discussing with the respective panelists, starting with Sir Mr. Kumar. So how do you see by 2030 the overall energy mix? Like any numbers you would like to share with everybody in terms of the consumption basket, final consumption energy basket?
So far as India is concerned, I do not know what what is happening around the globe, but so far as India is concerned, the target of 50% is a daunting target. It's a challenging target. Meeting 25%, 40-50% of electricity demand through renewable energy, it's a challenging target. So it's not an easy target, and it will require huge amount of finance. It will require huge amount of technology in terms of stability of the grid, because already I see the variation. During the daytime, the solar generation is almost touching 40,000 megawatt. And in the evening time, it comes down to 3,000 or 4,000 megawatt. The entire burden of balancing the grid comes upon the coal. So once the solar crosses 200 gigawatt or 300 gigawatt, this will be really a challenge unless we have some solutions to balance the grid. And that is the biggest challenge for balancing the grid. So for that, we need storage. It's the obvious solution, but storage is expensive. What we are not talking much about is the demand side management. Why can't we shift the demand to meet the generation curve? Some of the demand can be shifted, like agriculture demand can easily be shifted to meet the solar generation curve. At the moment in villages, the poor villagers are being supplied electricity during the evening hours or night hours. So that demand can be easily shifted to the day hours, which aligns with the solar generation time. Similarly, in other sectors also, we can have time of the day tariff. For industries, we can have time of the day tariff, that if you align your working hours with the renewable energy generation hours, so that will reduce the requirement of storage significantly and will help us in achieving bigger targets, bigger renewable energy integration. So this is one thing which we are missing in the entire the piece of discussion. Not much is being said about the demand side management, and perhaps it is not, what will I say frankly, that it is not a revenue earning proposition for the industry. So they are not talking much about it. For industry, it is the more of batteries, more of renewable energy capacity, more money, more capital, more capex, fine. Business for the bankers, business for solar manufacturers, business for battery manufacturers. But demand side management, we can achieve very good results without any capex at all. So that should be looked into. And if with that is also integrated with the appropriate battery or storage solution, with the financial support and technological support from the developed countries, I have no hesitation in my mind that we will be able to reach 50% of electrical energy requirement through renewable energy sources in India. And hydrogen also one, may I supplement the discussion? So far, we have been talking about green hydrogen generated from the electrolysis by using the renewable energy. But there is another source of green hydrogen, that is from the biomass. And Professor Dasappa of IISc Bangalore is working on this, working in this area for quite a long time. And KPIT in India is also working on this kind of a solution. Probably that should also requires support of the industry or research bodies abroad, because India is very rich in biomass. We have 60-70% of the area land mass dedicated to the agriculture, and we have huge biomass. If that can be converted into green hydrogen, okay, that will be great. we will be able to get rid of the problem of the burning of the biomass, which causes pollution in Delhi, and at the same time, we will get green hydrogen free of cost.
Absolutely.
So that should also be looked upon it. So these are my
Thank you,
views,
sir.
and I am very optimistic. And
Right,
the
sir.
technology Moore's law always takes place. We often achieve more than what we can dream in the technology.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you.
So I just moved to Gireesh for your closing remarks. You spoke about scope 1, scope 2. I think the world regulators are aligned pretty much on scope 1, scope 2 emissions. How do you see, like, the real challenge will be once regulators come heavy on scope 3, because that's what impacts the supply chain. How do you see that really unfolding as your closing remarks?
Yes, thanks for asking that. Actually, the more I've looked at scope 3, the more I realize that scope 3 is somewhat of a made-up problem. And the thing is this: if the regulators, just like what Mr. Kumar had said, if we are aligned on the common cause or we are all working together, right? If there is mandatory disclosure, and this is for the policymakers and regulators to get together and decide on it. If there's mandatory disclosure of scope 1 emissions for everybody, then scope 3 is automatically solved. So that is kind of my recommendation. Right now, what is happening is that everybody is trying to measure the scope 3 emissions by themselves. There's a huge replication of efforts. There's a lot of inefficiencies. But if you could just get everybody to report on their scope emissions, scope 1 emissions, not only scope 1 emissions at the company level, but what we call the scope 1 emission factors at the product level, then it all flows through. So I'll leave at this kind of provocative thought, and let's see if the regulators can figure this out.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Rahul, now to you. I'll leave it to you for your closing remarks.
Sure. No, so Aman, actually, I'd like to slightly beg to differ with Aniruddha ji slightly on the demand side thing, that industry is not looking into demand flexibility.
Don't take me so seriously.
In fact,
I was a little sarcastic.
the reason why this is very close to my heart is because actually I moved back to India in 2010 and we implemented first ever voluntary demand response program for Tata Power for India, where we provided 25 megawatt demand response in India. So in India, the problem is not that industry doesn't focus on demand side solutions. The problem is policymakers and especially utilities take demand flexibility for granted. In fact, even right now, there is a circular from one of the Gujarat utilities asking sort of a rotating load shedding, or basically asking companies to take on holidays on different days just to manage the summer right now. And this is something which is assumed that all this comes for free. Whereas demand flexibility also actually has a cost to the industry, to the consumer. So it should be like seen as it should be valued. And you should provide actually opportunity for customers to decide who wants to provide flexibility rather than assuming something directly at the feeder level, which has been happening throughout. And that's where actually one of the things which we didn't discuss in this is that while we keep on talking about, oh, there could be a 50 gigawatt hour requirement for grid side energy storage to meet 2030 renewable requirement, the fact is right now, each year we are selling more than 30-35 gigawatt hour of batteries each year for the backup for industry and customers who can afford to pay that. So this is something where I think demand side flexibility is really a great tool. But what we need is we need to have the policies which start valuing demand flexibility and not assume that it comes for free. And we are in fact in US managing right now 1,000 Tesla Powerwalls and providing grid services to Vermont utility. And same thing can be done in India. Technology already exists. Technology existed 5 years back for achieving that. What has been holding it off is two things. One is access to financing for deploying some of these technologies, and second thing has been the ability to monetize, because the regulators hasn't allowed energy storage and demand side technologies to get value for the services they can provide to the grid.
Another problem, Rahul ji, the smart metering infrastructure. Unless we have smart meters, we can't have the time of the day tariff and then the monetization of flexibility of consumption demand or anything. But that is a huge, like we have almost how many consumers? We have 300 million consumers in India. So replacing all the meters, replacing 300 million meters buy smart meters is a humongous
But
task.
Aniruddha, actually, that is actually I feel is a very wrong way of approaching that, because you need flexibility from maybe 5% or 10% of your customers. Most of the time already have the smart meter.
So I have been talking the same in my discussion in the ministry. I entirely agree with you, Mr. Rahul.
Thank you very much.
Right. I think I have to just hard stop because there's another panel discussion. So just taking last few comments from Jag, and then I thank everybody.
I'll keep it very short, Aman. and both the debate hit on, and we are trying demand response pilot and encountering all these challenges, Rahul, you just mentioned. Biggest challenge to decarbonizing in India, in my opinion, is the weak capacity and the poor financial status of the power distribution sector. And that ultimately is going to be the make or break for all the stuff that we are speaking tonight. So I'll leave it here, I think.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We had an amazing and a very insightful discussion with all the panelists representing the diverse facet. Thank you for your time. And I thank the audience out here from across the world who have been participating. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Rahul. Thank you, Gireesh. Thank you, Jag.
Thanks, Aman, for having us.
Bye.
And right, bye. It was interesting discussion and great knowledge.
Yes. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Aman.
Bye. Bye.
Testing, yeah. Thank you everyone for logging into today's panels and discussions. We are grateful to our speakers and moderators for taking time out on a Friday evening or morning, depending on where you're logging in from, and for sharing your valuable insights with us today. I'm going to keep this short. Please ensure you're here by 8 a.m. New York time or 5:30 p.m. IST tomorrow to engage with us on another day of insightful discussions and conversations. I'm going to quickly share the agenda for tomorrow right here. We start off with the welcome remarks at 7:45 or 5:15 IST. We'll move to the policy reforms discussion at 8 a.m. ET with Prapan Dasgupta and Dr. Sujit Bhalla, post which we'll have a global tech startups panel with the CEOs and co-founders of successful startups based in India, such as Dream11, Darwinworks, and GeoHaptic. Following this, we'll have a financing new growth opportunities panel where we'll have Amitabh Kant, the CEO of Niti Aayog, Manoj Kohli, and Bharat Kaushal. Following that, we'll have a future of work in India panel where we'll have CHROs of leading companies such as Infosys, Sun Pharma, Flipkart, and Bain India come in to speak about human capital in the post-pandemic world. After this, we'll have the OTT panel where we'll have leaders of OTT platforms such as Hotstar, TVF, and Pocket Aces, along with actors such as Prateek Gandhi and Naveen Kasturia. Closing this conference will be a fireside chat with Srimati Smriti Irani, who is our Union Minister of Women and Child Development in India. And that's where we'll end our conference tomorrow. Last but not the least, thank you so much to our audience for logging in today. Have a great the rest of your day or night for our folks in India and the other side of the globe. We thank the IBC 2022 team and of course our sponsors. See you tomorrow.